question for you guys. How many of you in your job or your line of work, or if you're a student, where you go to school, how many of you guys either work with or cross paths with people who do not know Jesus? Raise your hand. Look around the room. That is most of us, okay? There is a running theme in the Bible of godly people in ungodly places being used for God's kingdom. And interestingly enough, many of those people are being used for God's kingdom not as pastors and as priests or as church staff or nonprofit workers, but as politicians and artists and lawyers and beauty queens and CEOs. People like Joseph and Daniel and Esther and Nehemiah, men and women serving and living for God in work environments that are not centered around God. In fact, the scripture celebrates all kinds of men and women who serve God in unbelieving work environments. So here's the plan for the next 2 weeks. We're kind of entering into winding down this series that we've been doing on work. And the plan for the last 2 weeks of this series is to look at a few case studies of some of these men and the women in the scripture who serve and live for God in workplaces that are outside of the church. And the first one that I'd like to introduce you to tonight goes by the name of Daniel in the Old Testament. So if you have your Bible, you want to go ahead and open up to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. If you are new to the Bible, Daniel is in between Ezekiel and Hosea. And if you don't know where any of those books are, I have 3 magic words for you. Table of contents, all right? Nifty little resource in the beginning of your Bible. Or if you have the little cheater tabs on the side of your Bible, you can just whip right open there, those handy little things. But we all know Jesus would never have used the cheater tabs, would he have, right? Daniel, chapter 1, we're going to pick up the very beginning, verse 1. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials," which, if you're already getting hung up on some of these names, like Jehoiakim, Ashpenaz, you're in good company, right? This was written thousands of years ago. Names have changed a little, but bear with us. Look back at verse 3. So the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. They were young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The book of Daniel is what we call exilic literature, because it's one of the books in the Bible that deals with a time in Israel's history called the exile. And the goal today is to kind of look at some things that we can learn from Daniel's life. But in order to get there, we need to backtrack to do some important background on understanding the Babylonian captivity and God's call on Israel at this point in time. So if you want to real quick turn just 2 books to the left to Jeremiah. We're going to go to Jeremiah chapter 29. And we're kind of picking things up today right in the middle of the Bible, if you haven't noticed, and a lot has happened so far in the story to kind of catch you up to speed. And to make a long story short, God at this point, he had chosen a people called Israel, and he promised them through Abraham that he was going to bless them with all kinds of things, with land, with numerous offspring. He was going to pour out his blessing on his people. But he also promised them that if they disobeyed him and didn't listen to him and follow the instructions on obtaining these blessings, that they were going to miss out on some of those blessings. And sure enough, after years and years of Israel being disobedient to God and not following his calling on their life to live the way of blessed to be a blessing and to be set apart from the patterns of the world, after years of disobeying God, God allows Israel to be conquered by a pagan nation called Babylon. It's kind of a form of discipline to correct his people. And the king of Babylon at the time, his name was Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar led a campaign to defeat Judah and carry the whole nation of Israel away into the foreign land of Babylon for a period of about 70 years. And if you've been in the church for a while, a lot of you are kind of familiar with this idea of of captivity in Babylon for 70 years. But what a lot of people don't know is that King Nebuchadnezzar actually came a first time 10 years before he razed Jerusalem to the ground and took the whole nation away. He actually came 10 years before that, and the first time, he only took a slice of the population. He only took about 10,000 of the people of Judah back to Babylon, and it was 10,000 of the leaders and business professionals. And he takes these 10,000 leaders and their families back to Babylon to live there a decade before he brings everyone else. And the line of thinking goes that if they could get the leaders of the Israelite culture, I mean, how as a vassal nation do you get this nation to subject to the Babylonian ways rather than destroying them and wiping them out? The line of thinking went that if they could get these 10,000 predominant leaders to learn and buy into the Babylonian values and religion and philosophy and ethos and way of life, then the thinking was the rest of the nation would soon follow suit. You see, Nebuchadnezzar knew something. He knew that leaders influence culture. The Babylonians had been learning something. We'll throw that first slide up there. Leaders influence culture. The Babylonians were onto something that sociologists today have been saying for years, and that is the idea that culture is actually most shaped and influenced by a small percentage of people. And it's usually those who are in leadership positions within the government and politics and the arts and science and medicine or the entertainment industry or academics. These are people in key positions of influence in the city and in the world. And at Solid Rock, we actually do agree with what the sociologists are saying, and we see that leaders really do have a lot of influence in the culture. And some of you are here tonight, and you right now are working in positions of leadership in the city where you have influence. And we want to encourage you to continue to be faithful there, because those are amazing opportunities to bring God's kingdom to the world and the city around you. And a lot of you young people are trying to figure out what your career path is. And a lot of you are making decisions about higher education. And it's not for everyone, but we want to, as pastors, we want to pray with you guys and encourage you to think through some of these amazing opportunities. Many of you should go for an MBA or for med school or for law school, because those are terrific opportunities for God's kingdom. But back to the story, okay? This community, 10,000 early exiles and leaders, they show up to Israel, and here they are, away from Israel, where the government and the arts and the establishment all believes in the God of Israel, and now here they are away from Israel in a city, Babylon, and a culture that's actually hostile to the God of Israel. And so the question immediately arose, and it's a question that's still relevant today, but it's a question that goes along the lines of something like this. How in the world do we live a life of integrity as God's people in a pluralistic, polytheistic, unbelieving world? And there's all kinds of takes right away on the Israelites thinking of how they should relate to this city and live for God in a place where people around them didn't believe in God. But immediately some false prophets rose up. And this is what the gist of what they said. They said, don't move into the city. And so the Israelites actually initially, when they got there, they set up outside of the city of Babylon. And these false prophets were saying, don't go in the city. That's the wicked pagan city, and we are the people of God. Pray against them and wait for God to judge them and be as uninvolved with their city as possible. And Jeremiah, who's a true prophet of God, he catches wind of all this, and he comes in with God's perspective on how they should relate to the city around them. In this letter, we're going to pick up in Jeremiah 29, just read a little bit of it. And this is God's heart for how they should relate to the city around them. Verse 4 of Jeremiah 29. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Those words were no doubt shocking to some of the Israelites who were there sitting outside the city of Babylon at the time. And I want to just zero in on two quick things from what we just read. And the reason I'm doing this is because this text becomes like the blueprint for Daniel's life and how he relates to his city and his work environment full of people that didn't believe in God. But the first thing that God says in there is he says, to all those who I carried into exile. What's God saying? He's essentially saying, listen, you need to get a better picture of what's going on here. I have carried you into exile in Babylon. Your disobedience has put you in this difficult situation, but I'm the one who's taken you to this city, and I've taken you here for a reason. It's my plan to get my word out to the world. It's my plan to grow and to shape you and to grow and to shape the city of Babylon. And some of you here tonight, before we go any further, you need to be reminded that many of you, God has you in situations where you're working with people who don't worship God for a reason. Because he's wanting you to live out what Jesus called being the salt and the light of the world, having an influence and a window, an opportunity into people's lives to show them the love and the beauty of God. Some of us need to remember that the reason that he has you in circumstances where you're working with people who don't know God, that's for a reason. God's in that, and he's wanting to use you through that. But the second point that God makes in the text we just read is he's essentially saying, I refuse to let you believe that the only two options you have in how you relate to the city is either assimilation or separation. I refuse to let you believe that. Assimilation being the idea that you would just move into the city and become completely Babylonian and buy into the Babylonian way of life and practice. And separation being what the false prophets were saying. Separate, be as uninvolved in the culture as possible. Get out of the city, stay away. And God comes in through Jeremiah and he said, listen, those aren't your two only options, okay? In fact, he tells them to move into the city. And on the one hand, he indeed says, hey, don't assimilate. Don't just become like the Babylonians and live how they live. He says, know your number, right? Increase in number. He's essentially saying, know who you are. Don't lose your identity as my people in this city of people who don't worship God. Stay in covenant relationship with me. Be faithful. But he says, move into the city. And what we read, he says, build houses there, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry, and have sons and daughters there. And he says, seek the prosperity or the peace, the flourishing of the city. So God's essentially saying, I don't want you to assimilate, but I don't want you to separate either. In fact, I want you to be there. Move into the city. Pray for them. Seek their well-being. Have a presence there in the city. And I think it's no secret that today, these two ways of viewing how we relate to the world still exist in the church. There's some people on one side of the spectrum that say, get out of the city, separate, right? Move out to the country, pull your kids out of the public schools where they're learning all that garbage and go away. And so they form these Christian co-ops and you pray against evildoers and whatever else they do, churn your own butter and everyone wears Jesus uniforms. Right? That's pretty extreme. But sometimes that line of thinking comes in much more subtle ways. Like you actually do live in the city and you do work in an environment with people who don't know God. But if you really think about it without realizing it, all your closest network of people in your life that you really do life with are predominantly people who love and follow God. And you've never really taken the time to invest in any of the relationships at your work with people who don't know him. And if you dig deeper, some people might realize that they don't know any of their neighbors. They haven't taken the time to get to know any of the neighbors in their community who don't know God. And when it comes down to it, you just go to work and clock in and do your time to get away and hang out in your own neat little Christian bubble of people. And if that's you, chances are you might be a separatist without even realizing it. And that's one extreme that God doesn't want the Israelites to go to of how to relate to the city. But on the other hand, there's another camp in the church of people that say, no, we need to be relevant and involved in the city, but many followers of Jesus get swept up into going too far in that, and they end up doing things like, cussing to be hip, or going out and getting drunk with the guys from work every now and then to be cool and in with the guys, and in doing so, they're compromising in their faith, and they're falling into the vices of the city rather than telling the city a different story. And where should we land today as God's people and how we relate to the city and an unbelieving work environment? God encourages his people to adopt the following principle: to maintain a faithful presence in the city. God's saying, I want you to be there and present and deeply involved in the life of the city. I want you to love and serve and pray for and rub shoulders with people who are unbelievers, but all while maintaining a distinct identity and faithful presence as my people who are living my ways in the city. And I want you to seek the peace and the flourishing of the city. If they prosper, you too will prosper. Don't assimilate, don't separate, but have a faithful presence in the unbelieving city. With all that said, let's get to work in the book of Daniel. Go back to Daniel. We're going to see this kind of played out. Daniel serves as an example for us of what this looks like. Back to Daniel chapter 1. You guys doing all right? Still awake? Yeah, there's a lot of information. We're going to keep trekking, going for it. Daniel chapter 1. Daniel serves as a beautiful example for us of what this looks like. How do you relate to an unbelieving workplace in a way that honors God, being a faithful presence there, but living differently at the same time? And Daniel, in the passage we previously read in chapter 1, Daniel and some of his young friends have been selected to work in the Babylonian royal court for the king. And so they're going through these 3 years of training. And we'll pick up the story down in verse 8. In verse 8 it says, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, 'I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you.'" So Daniel and some of his friends, they're refusing to eat some of the royal food and the wine and some of the meats. And their supervisor, their boss, is a little concerned because he's like, I don't want the king to notice that some of these guys we're training to work in the royal court are all of a sudden getting thin and scrawny, right? We'll keep moving in the story. Verse 11. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, he said, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. So Daniel and his couple friends, they refused to eat some of these meats and the royal food, and we don't know exactly why that is, if it was because they were meats that were prohibited in the Jewish Levitical law, or whether it was meats that were sacrificed to the Babylonian gods, but for some reason, Daniel has this conviction to have integrity in his work, and for him it meant making this decision to not eat some of the royal food that he considered to have been sin. And if you're taking notes, I just want to point out 3 things that we can learn from Daniel about how to live for God in an unbelieving work environment. And I think lesson number 1 that we can get from Daniel is decide in advance to have purity and integrity in your work. Decide in advance to have purity and integrity in your work. In verse 8, it says that Daniel resolved to not let himself be defiled. Or in other words, he made a commitment. He decided in advance to not compromise in his work environment, to stay faithful as a committed follower of God, to remain pure, even if it meant sacrificing something. Daniel and his friends, they were committed to honoring God in their workplace to a point where, the boss was worried that they were going to get too thin and scrawny because all they were eating was vegetables, right? I mean, that was sacrifice for some young guys to only eat vegetables. I mean, that's like all that John Mark eats, right? Miserable. So, sometimes as meat eaters, got to make our stand. But I think there's something really important that we can learn from Daniel in this passage, and that is that godliness doesn't come by accident, right? Being pure, living a life of integrity where you honor God, walking in holiness before God in an unbelieving world, that's not the kind of thing that comes by accident. I think remaining pure in any facet of life requires a conscious decision that you make, like Daniel. There's a dimension of intentionality to it. If you want to be pure, if you want to avoid just kind of chameleonizing and blending in to the culture around you and buying into their values, if you want to stay pure and maintain a faithful presence in the places that God has put you in, purity is something that you have to be really intentional and aggressive and proactive about fighting for and pursuing in your life. You can't just kind of drift by through life and hope that you end up pure in the end by chance or surprise. Daniel, it says he resolved not to let himself be defiled. And notice, that doesn't mean that Daniel separated and ran away, and because they were offering some of this food, he quit his job and went and lived outside the city. Daniel, he's there working for the Babylonians, serving them, but he made a decision to live differently in that work environment. If you want to be pure and keep a faithful presence in your workplace, then make a decision that you'll stick to where your number one priority in your work, first and foremost, is to be a faithful worshiper of God through your work. And everything else comes secondary to that. Decide in advance to not let yourself be defiled, not to cave into temptation when it comes your way, and make that decision before the temptation presents itself. For some of you, this might mean thinking through your work environment that you already work in and opportunities that you've already seen for temptation so far in your work, and thinking through, for example, if you've realized that lunchtime or lunch break is the time that the other guys are usually telling all these dirty jokes at your work, it might mean making a conscious decision that you're not going to participate in those dirty jokes, but you're going to look for loving and creative ways to maybe steer those conversations in different directions. Not obnoxious or rude ways, but innovative, loving ways to kind of steer those conversations towards something that might be more honoring to God, resolving. What does it look like for you to decide in advance to honor God in your workplace? It might mean that if some of your coworkers go out to a strip club every now and then, that you make a decision in advance that when those opportunities come up, that's an activity that you're never going to be a part of, right? You'll do some other things with the guys at work, but that's something that you'll never do. Maybe it means at your workplace making a conscious decision that when other people are bad-mouthing your boss when she's not around, or gossiping about another coworker, that you've made a decision in advance that you're going to be someone who doesn't have anything negative to say, so that you can live differently, be an example. I remember when I was getting ready to go to college, I have a 4-year degree in business marketing, by the way, from Oregon State University. The other school in Oregon, the good one, yeah. Slide that in there. Oh, there's some hurt ducks right now. We're going to move on. But when I was making the decision to go to Oregon State, I remember God really clearly put on my heart that I needed to make a conscious decision, that I was going to live for God, that my priority first and foremost was to be pure and honor God with my time, with my 4 years at a school where the way of Jesus is not what's being taught or practiced. And some of you here who are students, you need to remember that if you are a student right now, for many of you, that is the work that God has called you to for this season of life. And for lots of you, that's the environment where you are going to be interacting with people who don't know Jesus. But I had to make a conscious decision to honor God. I decided in advance that I wasn't going to cheat on tests or look for the easy route in group projects, or I wasn't going to let myself be put in vulnerable situations with girls or by going to parties where there was alcohol, because I knew I wasn't above anyone else, and I needed to make a decision where purity was a main objective that I was going to fight for, because I wanted to honor God with that. And as a college pastor, and having been a youth pastor a couple years before that, I've worked with students who didn't make a decision like that going into high school or going into college. They didn't make a commitment to be pure, and many times, unfortunately, because of it, they end up failing or falling into some of the vices of their campus or their city. And maybe you're here tonight and you're starting at a new school come this fall or in the spring right now. Or maybe you're here and you're just switching jobs or starting at a new company, about to start something new. The encouragement for you tonight is to purpose in your heart, make a conscious decision that first and foremost, before anything else, you are going to this school or you are going into this workplace to honor Jesus with your time there. Maybe you're here and you failed in some of this so far at work or in school, and you need to hear that there's forgiveness when you come to Jesus and confess where you've already slipped up, and you can make a fresh decision to honor God and be pure and have integrity. And this line of thinking, it trickles into all kinds of facets of life. In your marriage, making a commitment, I want to be faithful and pure and have integrity in my marriage. And if you failed in that already, there's forgiveness as you come to Jesus and surrender and pray, and God can begin to do a redemptive work in your life through that. I want to look at a second thing that we can learn from Daniel about how to honor God in the workplace. In order to do this, I want to just kind of hop back up to verse 4 of chapter 1, which you read earlier. It's a description of Daniel and his friends who are being pulled into this training for the royal court. In verse 4, it says, they were young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So notice that Daniel was well-versed in the language and the literature of the Babylonians. It says that he and his friends, they had aptitude in every kind of learning. Skip down to verse 17. It says, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding, all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. And pay attention to the wording here in verse 20. Look down at verse 20. It says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. So after studying and training for their job in the royal court for 3 years intensively, Daniel and his friends get pulled in for kind of a final oral exam to get into their job, and they're put before the king to present. Think of how intimidating that would be, right before the man, right? And they're standing there, but they excel. They do really well because, well, God's hand was with them, but they also studied rigorously all the literature and the ways. They were very knowledgeable of Babylon and what they were trying to accomplish there. They excelled in their work. And notice the narrative is really trying to make a point. Notice that in chapter 1, the point that the narrative is making is that these couple young Jewish guys who are foreigners, these young Jewish guys working for the Babylonian government are better than all the other Babylonian workers and enchanters. Daniel and his friends, they were the best out of all of them. They studied the culture, the politics, the language, everything Babylonian. They even took on some Babylonian names. You might not have caught, but back in verse 7, Daniel, he actually has 2 names. He goes by Daniel, his Hebrew name, which means God is my judge, but he also was given a name, Belteshazzar, which is a Babylonian name, which means Bel is my God. And Bel's a Babylonian god. Why would Daniel accept that name or let people call him that? I think because Daniel, like a missionary, was adapting to his culture and finding ways to love and serve his workplace in the ways that he could without compromising in his faith. He didn't compromise, but he was fully engaged. And second thing, if you're taking notes, I think we can learn from Daniel about how to honor God in an unbelieving work environment is fully engage in your work and your work environment. Fully engage. How engaged are you in your work? Notice that Daniel, it says he excelled in his work for the Babylonians to the extent where verse 20 says that the king found him and his friends to be 10 times better than all the other workers in the kingdom. I love that little insight there. How do you approach your work at this point where God has you in life, in your job, in your line of work? What's your reputation there? What are the other people who don't know Jesus, what do they see when they look at your work ethic? Don't just punch in the clock as a follower of Jesus, but be the best that you can. Work hard to excel. Work for the flourishing of your company. Are you fully engaged in your work? Or are you just kind of, working to get by? Some people just kind of work for the weekends, so they go out and play all weekend long. And other people, followers of Jesus, out there work for the weekend so they can go be at church all weekend, which might be a little bit better. But the calling of the Scripture is to find a life posture of honoring and worshiping God right there in our work, right in the 8 to 5 or the 9 to 5 throughout the week. What if you saw yourself as being called to Nordstrom, or being carried by God into your position at Intel, or being called by God to baristaing at Starbucks, to honor him in that work and be a witness to the people who are there, or called by God into parenting, to pour into your children and invest in what God's doing in their lives? What does it look like for you to fully engage in your work? I think for lots of us, that might mean, like Daniel, aiming to be one of the hardest workers in your company, or aiming to be one of the best employees that you can be in your business as an act of worship. Or it might mean taking some extra time to really study and better get a handle of the language and philosophies and strategy of your company. Being the employee that best knows the language and the values of Nike, or being the worker who best understands the values and mission and strategy of Intel, because you're fully engaging in that work and seeking the flourishing and prospering of that company like God calls us to. For lots of us, I think fully engaging in our work means to simply be there at our work and to be awake and ready and present in mind and engaged in what we're doing. Not being on social media all throughout the day, cruising through people's Facebook pages and leaving comments, or texting people throughout the workday, but turning off the social media and fully engaging in our work. For others of you, it might mean being interested or taking an interest in some of the activities that some of your coworkers are into, whether it's like running and biking together, going to a Blazer game, or golfing, or whatever that might look like, but engaging in some of the activities that people around you who don't know Jesus are into, finding connection points where you can build relationships with them. And by the way, I need to clarify, there's some lines of work that aren't good for us to fully engage in. Right? Like if you work for a company, that rents out films that have pornography in them, or you work for a nightclub that enables people to get drunk all night long, you might have to take a step back and think through whether or not that's the best environment for you to serve God in general. And you might need to stop working for a company that's directly leading people in dishonoring God to go work in another situation with unbelievers where you have a better opportunity to actually be a faithful presence. There's, of course, some activities, if it is the guys going to the strip club or whatever, there's some after-hour work activities that you shouldn't fully engage in. But the idea is seeking ways in your work to be as resourceful and hardworking and personable and as relatable as you can without chameleonizing and blending in and compromising your faith, but being fully engaged in what God's doing. There's been a kind of a neat example of a man from our church that's been in the public eye recently, Coach Caleb Canales for the Portland Trailblazers. He comes here to Solid Rock and totally loves God, and he has a long story. He was working as an assistant coach for the Blazers coming into this year, and through a long chain of events, abruptly this last week or so, he was thrown into the position of being the interim head coach for the Blazers for the rest of the year. And all of a sudden, there's this spotlight on him, and people are really intrigued by his story. There's all kinds of newspaper articles this last week because he's the youngest head coach in the NBA right now at age 33. And there's all these articles talking about Caleb's work ethic, saying his work ethic is second to none. He's such a hard worker. He's so committed. He's one of the most dedicated people in their organization. And the players talk about how Caleb actually, they can tell that he cares about them and seeks their best interests and invests in their lives. And they say he's a hard worker, but at the same time, I was reading an article, the front page of the Oregonian, that said he's such a hard worker and such a good worker, but he's also deeply spiritual, was the wording that they used. And it said something along the lines of, when he's not doing basketball stuff, you'll most likely find him reading his scriptures. And another line, it said, he's never cussed and alcohol has never touched his lips. I love that. Caleb, here you have a perfect example of everything we're talking about. Someone who's fully engaged and working hard and seeking the flourishing of the company and the work that God's brought him to, but remaining a distinct, faithful presence. Fully engage in your work and your work environment. I want to look at one last thing I wanted to point out that we can learn from Daniel before we wrap up. But in order to do that, I want to fast forward a bit in the narrative to chapter 6. So go ahead and turn some pages forward to Daniel chapter 6. We doing all right, people? Good? Hanging in there? Daniel chapter 6. In the story, things start getting a little complicated for Daniel, a little difficult. And those of you who are working with people who don't believe in God, you know that a lot of the things I'm talking about, it doesn't work like a simple formula. Sometimes it gets kind of messy and confusing when we think about what it means to live for God and be present and fully engaged, but still live and do things differently than the world around us. That doesn't always come down to a simple science. Sometimes you really have to wrestle through this, but such is a lot of life where we're living for Jesus in a world where not everybody likes Jesus. A lot of following God is like that. And Daniel, because of his commitment for purity and integrity and to do the right thing in his work, it starts to put him in some tough circumstances. We're going to pick up in one of those in chapter 6. Look at verse 1. It says, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." Now we think a great deal of time has passed between chapter 1 and chapter 6. Scholars put Daniel in chapter 6 at the age of 80. So it's at least like 30 or something years later. And Daniel's actually maintained a high government position through the change of a regime, right? King Nebuchadnezzar is out, and now Darius the Mede is king. And Daniel, through all of this, has kept a high-ranking government position for the empire, which I think says a lot about Daniel's commitment and his ability to adapt to an ever-evolving culture and a work environment and work for different bosses that come in and out of his business and to still do a good job. And I think most of us need to hear that when we talk about this, being a faithful presence in your city or in your company, what we're talking about is something that's for most of us going to be a lifetime's work. Okay, it's not something that happens in a couple weeks, being a faithful presence for God in your city or your workplace. But for many of us, that's a lifetime's work, where every week, one day at a time, each day on your way to work, you're praying, God, help me be a faithful presence for you today in my work environment. God, I'm purposing in my heart to stay away from temptation. Please protect me from stumbling in any way at work today or work this week. Help me to have integrity in what I do. And where one day at a time, week by week, over years, people begin to notice that there's something different, something almost right about how you're living and how you're approaching your work. But for many of us, that's a lifetime's work, something that we need to continue to be faithful in. And I think Daniel's a really gripping model of this. But by this point in Daniel chapter 6, Daniel's the equivalent of like a prime minister. He's worked his way up in government responsibility, and he's doing such an outstanding job that in the verse we just read, it says that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And these satraps and administrators, they're guys that we're overseeing like regional taxation and things like that. Daniel's coworkers, essentially. And it says that the king wanted to set him above all of his other coworkers. And look at their reaction to this, the other coworkers. Look at verse 4. It says, "At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, 'We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God.'" His other coworkers, they become jealous of Daniel because he's being promoted and doing such a good job. And so they try to go after him to get him out of that position. They dig to try to find some kind of flaw or complaint or error or blemish in Daniel's life. But they can't find anything. And notice, even when they dug deep to find dirt on Daniel, they came up empty-handed. It says that they could find no corruption in him because he's trustworthy. He was neither corrupt nor negligent. Can you imagine people going into your personal and work records, searching for some kind of flaw, going through your cell phone and your computer history and interviewing people from your past, just looking for one blemish that they could bring against you. Unfortunately, we see this in the public and politics all the time. Politicians trying to find dirt on this other candidate to put him down, and this still happens today. But here's a question. If people were to try to dig up dirt on you, what would they find? What would they find if they really went searching and looking? And none of us are perfect by any means, but the goal is to be such a faithful presence for God over time that people who don't know Jesus wouldn't have any reason to be confused about what or who you're living for. The Bible uses words like being blameless or above reproach or beyond accusation. Well, they can't find anything wrong with Daniel. They search and they dig. They can't find anything wrong because he had integrity. So the only thing left for them to go after is his faith in God. So they set up a trap for Daniel, and they convinced the king to issue this decree where for 30 days, no one in the kingdom can pray to or worship any god other than the king himself. It's kind of a trap that Daniel, he's always praying and worshiping his God of Israel. Let's set this decree up so that only people can worship the king, and we know that Daniel slipped up in it. Look at verse 10. We'll see what happens. Chapter 6, verse 10. It says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." So as soon as Daniel heard that this document was signed, he went straight to his house and he prayed. And not only did he pray, but he opened his windows toward Jerusalem, where God's presence had been back at the temple before, and he prays to God with the windows open. And Daniel, he wasn't like a closet committed follower of God. He was pretty open about his faith and straightforward about his faith. But if you read through the narrative, he's not obnoxious about it. He's not like preachy and in people's faces and Bible thumping. You won't find that in the narrative, but he's a steady, consistent follower of God, taking a stand for the things and the ways of God while loving and serving and blessing the organization, the kingdom that he's working for. And he does the right thing. That this decree goes out, but he still prays to God, even if it meant that there would be consequences. And the third and final thing that I think we can learn from Daniel about how to honor God in an unbelieving work environment is to do the right thing even when it hurts, even when it's costly. Daniel doesn't compromise or turn his back on God when things heat up. He doesn't go back on his commitment to be faithful to God, even under pressure. Later in the New Testament, James is writing encouragement to the church, and he talks about suffering and hardship and temptations for followers of Jesus. And the word that he uses to describe all those things is the word test. He says these are tests that come your way. And for followers of Jesus, whenever you face temptation to compromise or hardship, suffering that challenges your faith, those are tests to see whether or not you really are living for and worshiping God with your life. Well, Daniel passes that test. He still worships and prays to God even after they issue the decree. And a lot of you know what happened next, right? They sentenced Daniel to death because of it. And they take him and they put him in a lion's den. Because back in the ancient Near East, they didn't have federal prisons. They just had the cave out back full of starving lions, So they throw Daniel in there to be put to death. And so Daniel ends up in this lion's den for doing what is right. And my question is, how far are you willing to go to do the right thing in your workplace? In the situation that God has you with people who aren't worshiping God, are you giving in to fear of what other people might think of you or what your boss might think of you if you recommend the route that will be more honoring to God, to your company? Are you going to do just what everyone else is doing when they're stretching the hours on their timesheet or ditching out of work early when the boss isn't there? Or maybe like me, you've worked for a company in the past where there's kind of this corporate game that takes place, where everyone within the company is kind of networking and essentially taking advantage of other people in order to promote themselves and get ahead. And the question is, are you just going to play that same old game that everyone else is playing? Or are you going to live a different story at your work? Are you going to do what's right, even if it might cost you something, a promotion or whatever that might look like? Daniel, he had complete integrity, and he's bold. He's bold with his faith, but not in an obnoxious way. He's not standing on a soapbox preaching, but he has a steady commitment and faithfulness and purity in his work, even if it was costly. And many of you guys know how the story goes. God spares Daniel from the lion's den. It's a miracle. God stops the mouths of the lion, and after Daniel's in there for a period of time, they open the door, and he survives without a scratch, much to everyone's surprise. And the king, I want to zero in on what King Darius, the pagan king, what he says in response to seeing that Daniel has survived. This is the last thing we'll read in Daniel. Look down at chapter 6, verse 25. It says, "Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, 'May you prosper greatly.' He says, 'I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel.'" This is a pagan king, right? Because of Daniel's actions. Look at, he goes on, "For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Because of Daniel's actions and his faithful presence, even when it cost him something and put him in harm's way, because of that, this king who didn't believe in God is now worshiping the one true God. The same king that a matter of time earlier hastily issued this decree where no one could worship him, he now, because of Daniel's lifestyle and commitment, even in the face of difficulty and challenges, he comes to worship the one true living God. And the story kind of closes in verse 28 by saying that Daniel prospers during the reigns of the next two kings. Notice that language. Remember it from back in Jeremiah. If the city prospers, you too will prosper. I can't help but close by going to just one thought in the New Testament. We'll kind of land the plane and wrap this all up. I just want to read two verses. You don't have to turn there. I can just read it for you. But if you want, it's 1 Peter chapter 2. In verse 11, we were just there with Jeff Vanderstelt a week or two ago, but I want to look at Peter's language. Now, Peter's writing to encourage followers of Jesus in the New Testament who are wrestling through how to relate to their city that doesn't believe in God. And here's what he says in chapter 2 and verse 11. He says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." Peter sees parallels between Jews living like Daniel in the time of exile and followers of Jesus today who are living in a pluralistic, secular society. And Peter calls them, he calls followers of Jesus foreigners. He calls us exiles. Notice the language. Because although we see glimpses of God's kingdom advancing, for the most part, we still live in a world and a culture that doesn't seek to worship God. And you and I don't live in an enclave surrounded by only followers of Jesus living outside of the city, but you and I live right in the thick of the city. And most of us are working jobs like Daniel with people who don't seek to honor God with their lives. And what's Peter's advice to people like you and me? Essentially, his advice is live like Daniel. He says live amongst those who don't know Jesus and live such compelling lives that those watching will be able to find nothing to accuse you of. They might see your good deeds and glorify God when he comes. This week, what does it mean for you to decide in advance you're going to have purity and integrity in your work environment? When you go into work tomorrow morning, what would it look like for you to fully engage in your work? To fully engage or invest in these relationships? Or if you're a parent, what does it look like to fully engage in what God's doing in the life of your kids? Which if you're a parent, by the way, that is also a huge part of the work that God has called you to, which means you don't clock out when you go home from work. But what does it look like to fully engage in your work? And are you prepared this week to do the right thing, even if it hurts, even if it might cost you something? Because first and foremost, before income, before promotions, before anything else, your goal is to be a faithful presence, to honor God in what you do. And the goal is that you and I, as followers of Jesus today, like Daniel, that we would, in a city like Portland, live such a compelling story and have such a faithful presence over time that people would be drawn in to worshiping the one true living God. Let's pray.